So this is me. I've been in the industry for a little over 25 years, and I have worked across the spectrum for both sponsors, CROs, worked for small nutraceutical companies. I've done audits. I did start out as a research coordinator. I've been a CRA lead, CRA manager, and most recently worked as director of clinical operations, as well as conducted a number of quality assurance audits in the past several years. So everything we'll talk about today will be focused on best practices, compilation of what the regulations say, the intent, how I've seen it applied, and also things I've seen as issues or challenges or concerns with regulatory agencies. The class today is really geared towards sort of the guidance that came out in 2023 in terms of the FDA's perspective. But as you know, ICH E6 was just finalized in January. So I didn't include the pieces of that in here because this is supposed to be FDA focused. But with that said, I'll definitely talk about it just for you because, again, you have this much more international focus. I'm not as familiar with what regulations you might need to know or what the nuances might be in terms of South Africa, but feel free to chime in and sort of share any contrasts or questions or concerns that come up with maybe what the FDA says and what you might be seeing in other places, because especially being with the NIH, I think you're very aware that, we're always looking at what is the intent, because the language itself appears to be black and white, but then you apply all these nuances and all these different situations in terms of, well, what is risk in different areas? Or when you're dealing with a country that you have a high number of illiterate patients, the rules don't change, but you really have to look at them. How do we apply them very practically? How do we get this done? It's no longer a matter of having a robust informed consent that's 30 pages long. It's having an informed consent that people can actually understand. So we'll talk about that in terms of the intent and just what does the FDA currently say in terms of their guidance documents. So when we talk about informed consent, we know the main thing is, as with all research, that quality is never the result of an accident. So I always feel like that's, such a generic statement, but something we really have to think about because it doesn't just happen. We always have the best intention. And I think one thing we run into with our research sites is when there is a problem, they're very defensive because in their eyes, they did the best patient care they possibly could. And they probably did. But when you then have to take all of the rules we have within research, we have to really help them understand the nuances, the differences. That, when you do an informed consent process, it's very different than just handing somebody a form that they quickly sign. Probably one of my main personal experiences that makes me think about the ethics behind research was it being injured. I'm a pretty active equestrian, and I was working with a young horse who slipped and fell on top of me. I was knocked out cold, came to, I was by myself, got myself to the hospital, but by the time I got there, I was having trouble moving my legs, I was having trouble walking, was pretty out of it. And when they checked me in, I know they handed me a form, and they basically said, sign this and we'll get started. And it really was, whether it was the nurse or the technician who had it on an iPad, just flipped it around, handed me the little stylus, and I just scribbled something. To this date, I don't actually know what I signed. I always joke that, that day I may have agreed to give away all my organs. I don't know. And the thought behind that is that the same people who are running these day-to-day practices in the emergency room or in a crisis situation or in a third world country or even in a first world country, but who haven't done research before, they don't think about what is it that we actually have to convey? Why is this so important? What kinds of things do we really need to explain? And with the wealth of experience we all have, we really think about where did research come from? Where did informed consent come from? And we can certainly track it back to World War II as sort of our big eye-opener, where the concept was do no harm in terms of the Hippocratic Oath. And we'd like to think that our physicians follow that each and every day. But in World War II, experiments were done in the name of research to help the soldiers. Things like hypothermia experiments, dropping acid on people's skin, embedding false shrapnel to see would people survive? What happens if they get gangrene? What happens if we amputate? What happens if we don't amputate? What happens if we remove organs? And in the Nazi war criminal trials, these individuals were held accountable for everything that happened. And their defense was, well, it was a time of war. We needed the information. So in response to that, we adopted the Declaration of Helsinki and started out the Nuremberg Code, moved into Declaration of Helsinki, and is now the basis for ICH-GCP. This concept, these very core fundamental principles that really have to state how we do no harm. So taking that Hippocratic oath and putting it into bullet points, so to speak. And certainly we know that some of those points are that every patient must have an informed consent, that it must be voluntary, that we cannot coerce, that we must make sure that patients are not vulnerable at the time of informed consent or the time they're approached for a research study. And recent revisions, ICH-GCP E6 Revision 3, has really elaborated on those core principles. So if you take a look at that new document, you'll see that not only are all the sections reordered, renumbered, and content slightly modified, but those core principles themselves that came from the Declaration of Helsinki have completely changed. The basic verbiage is still there in terms of those initial 13 principles, but they've been expanded upon. And especially regarding informed consent, a lot of new thoughts around not just how do we ensure voluntary consent, but what does this mean across different patient populations? What does this mean in different settings?